Mind and Matter podcast, where we talk about how what you consume, from food to drugs and ideas, influences who you become. I'm your host, Nick Jikomis, and I have a background in academic science, independent research, and writing, and I'm the creator of the Mind and Matter podcast and Substack page. I got a PhD in neuroscience from Harvard University, where I studied the neurobiology of feeding behavior, and before that, I studied evolutionary genetics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. On normal episodes of the podcast, I talk mainly with scientists, academics, and other experts about topics that interest me as a biologist, ranging from neuroscience to metabolism, evolution, animal behavior, and the effects of drug, food, and biotechnology. This episode is part of a special sub-series where I talk to independent scholars who are often not affiliated with major institutions like universities, but who I believe have interesting perspectives. These conversations are often more multidisciplinary in nature, connecting my areas of scientific interest with subjects spanning social psychology, culture, religion, history, and the rise and fall of civilizations, areas which may sometimes be more taboo, controversial, or outside the Overton window of popular discourse. These episodes are available in full to paid subscribers on the Mind and Matter Substack page or my YouTube channel. If you're hearing this version, you are a paid subscriber, and I thank you for your support. With that, I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Thank you for having me, Nick. It's an honor. Thank you.
Can you just tell everyone a little bit about, who you are, what your background is?
So my background is I was a guy who had absolutely no interest in anything to do with diets. I grew up with a mother who was overweight, who went through Weight Watchers, and I watched her weight yo-yo over the years. And I came to the conclusion that the whole diet thing was kind of baloney. And I figured that if I followed the expert advice, which was mainly the dietary guidelines, that I would be just fine. I was a real science nerd as a kid. When I had to study for the AP Bio class, I just read the textbook the night before the final exam, and that was all I needed to do. And I, aced it. I had a real fascination with biology. So I knew enough about evolutionary history never to really buy into the saturated fat is bad mantra, just because I understood the biology and the history of it. But that said, if you're in the modern food environment, unless you go out of your way to eat a lot of saturated fat, you don't eat a lot of saturated fat. So
can you actually
getting...
expand on that a little bit? What do you mean you knew about the evolutionary history and what that meant for saturated fat consumption?
Well, I knew that humans evolved eating a lot of animal fat, right, and dairy fat, and that these were consistent and widespread parts of human diets all over the world. So I found it just unlikely, without knowing anything about the biochemistry of the epidemiology. It just struck me as something that was, it didn't make sense, right? Why would we eat something for so long that was bad for us?
Yeah, there's actually, I think, a very important lesson lurking in what you just said, which is you can actually make, I don't even want to say educated guesses. You can sort of know things that are very likely or very unlikely to be true about your own body by understanding the evolutionary history of our species, even if you don't know very much about the mechanistic details by which certain processes operate.
Yeah, you can definitely. You can also make some horrible mistakes.
Yeah.
So anyway, I professionally, I am self-taught in technology and finance, and found myself first a trader at a hedge fund, and then ultimately the chief technology officer of a hedge fund, and in charge of all their risk systems and accounting systems and a lot of other stuff. But then I started getting these various different, at the time, seemingly unrelated illnesses. And ultimately I was able, through revisiting my aversion to diet and doing a little bit of research, figuring out that that if I changed my diet in a more evolutionarily consistent manner, that all of my illnesses went away, including things that it never would have occurred to me were related to diet.
Do you mind sharing what some of those issues were?
Well, sure. I had a history of allergies in my family. I had was susceptible to sunburn. I mean, you're looking at me. That won't come as a surprise to you. Blonde and blue eyes for the podcast listeners out there. Um, I started getting these intestinal problems. I was hospitalized a couple of times because I was vomiting blood.
Hmm.
Um, and they weren't able to figure out what was going on with that. I started breaking a lot of bones. I was hospitalized for what they initially thought was a stroke when I was 38 years old. Um, I got acute diverticulitis when I was 40 years old and was hospitalized a number of times for that and ultimately had to have a colon resection. And a lot of it, I gained the classic gained a pound a year, after my 20s, which I thought was just normal.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and a lot of this stuff was just stuff that I attributed to aging. And then when I actually, you know, fixed my diet and kind of better looking than smart, as they say, the first intervention that I tried was cutting seed oils out of my diet.
Mhm.
And everything else that I learned followed from that.
Why was that? Why was it the first intervention? How did you happen upon that as a potential strategy?
I had been reading Stefan Guyenet's blog back in 2009, and I got turned on to that because I had an interest in the time at barefoot running, and one of the guys I knew turned me on to one of his malocclusion series, right? Which is malocclusion is the fact that your teeth don't fit correctly into your jaw. And this is again something that I thought was genetic. I had bad teeth. My mother had bad teeth. My grandmother had bad teeth. Must be genetic. And Stefan's posts were definitive in convincing me that it was clearly the result of a bad diet.
Hmm.
Um, and that opened up my mind to the fact that diet could have a huge impact on your health because one of the banes of my existence is seeing the dentist, which I did a lot of as a kid. I had 8 teeth pulled out and some number of cavities, which I long ago lost count of. Plus, I had a dentist who was a smoker, so his fingers tasted like cigarette butts. It was disgusting. So I have lots of bad memories of the dentist. So realizing and I had, at this point, this was when I was 42 years old. I had cut sugar out of my diet when I was 18 or 19 because of a dentist who told me that if I
Hmm.
didn't want to see the dentist anymore, all I had to do was stop eating sugar. So I did. And he was right. And since, I'm now 18 to 56, which is how old I am, I've had one tiny cavity in all of those years after cutting sugar out of my diet. So I was open to the idea that having a dietary change could have a major impact on your health. I just
Mhm.
didn't really know enough about it to do anything intelligent. So Stefan had a post about skin health and cancer and seed oils and dietary fats that I found really interesting. And that was when, obviously my father's had skin cancer, my mother's had skin cancer. It's a thing in my family. So one day I walked down to the end, I was at work and I walked down to the end of the salad bar and looked at these squeeze bottles of various different salad dressings and thought to myself, that's got to be the worst, cheapest oils known to man to make it into this place. And right then I decided to stop eating seed oils and see what happened. And at that point I had, this was 2 years after my colon resection. So at that point I'd had irritable bowel disease for 16 years consistently.
Mhm.
I used to have to travel around with a roll of toilet paper and a backpack just in case of an emergency. And that resolved in 2 days. 2 days. And I posted on my blog the email that I sent to Stefan DNA after that. he was very helpful in helping me get, started in what to learn about this. And I was like, I can't believe this. This is just 16 years, seriously, and it resolves in 2 days.
And it
So
stayed that way afterwards?
yeah, well, I can, I mean, I'm a self-taught engineer, so I take very little for granted. I did a lot of experimenting with adding foods in, taking foods back out, seeing which foods and which combination of foods would cause the symptoms of my irritable bowel disease. For me, it's seed oils, wheat, and chili peppers.
Hmm.
I love chili peppers. Just thinking about them makes my mouth water. But that combination will put me into agony in a very short term. So things like breaded chicken wings are just catastrophe for me.
Mhm.
Now, if I mix the ingredients around, if they're fried in something other than seed oils or baked or whatever, and they're not too spicy, then I'm fine with them. But I
Hmm.
did a lot of experimenting to figure out what I couldn't eat,
Yeah.
and some of it was accidental. I discovered soybean oil had wheat in it. Who would think?
Mm. Yeah.
Because I went to the Whole Foods and bought one of their little trays of sushi and ate it. And on the way out to the car, I got these massive stomach cramps, like bent over in the parking lot stomach cramps. And I went back in, got the thing out of the garbage can, read the ingredients, and discovered that there was wheat in the soybean oil. Who
Huh.
knew?
Yeah. And so, very briefly, just for those who don't know, what are seed oils?
Seed oils are fats that are derived from seeds. Right? Seems a little simplistic. I use that term, and it's used in nutrition because it's distinct from vegetable oils, which include things that are oils made from the fruit of a plant. So an
Mm-hmm.
olive has a pit, which is the seed, and then it has the soft part surrounding it, which is the fruit. Traditionally, an olive was made by squeezing the fruit so that the oil would come out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Avocados are similar. There are some caveats in there, and I'm going to leave a lot of
Yeah.
caveats as we go through this stuff just to try and keep the message a little
Yeah. Yeah.
simple and
But
more concise.
in every, like when everyday people hear vegetable oil, that typically does refer to seed oils.
Although they'd include olive oil in that, and I would
Yep.
not. Or
Yep.
they'd include coconut oil in
Yep.
that, which I would not.
And what would be like, so basically the question is, why don't you include those things together? What is it about their composition that distinguishes what you call seed oils from some of these others?
So the fatty acid composition of these oils is what's significant.
Mm-hmm.
And oils that come from fruits and tropical oils tend to have a very different fatty acid composition than seed oils. You know, and this is true in animals as well. So, for instance, fish that live in more northerly waters where it's colder tend to have more polyunsaturated fat in their flesh than fish that live in warmer waters. And the reason is saturated fats solidify and polyunsaturated fats do not. So, in theory, if you took a salmon or not a salmon, but if you took a tropical fish
Mm-hmm.
and put it in cold water, it would be unable to move because the membranes of its cells would lose their elasticity and the protein pumps in the cells would stop being able to function at the rate that the animal required.
Mm-hmm.
So it would, and in bacteria, we see this. Bacteria, depending on the ambient temperature, will rapidly alter the fatty acid composition of their membranes so that they continue to function in a consistent way.
Yeah. Yeah. So the membrane needs a certain level of elasticity to for the biomechanics of all the stuff in the membrane to work, basically.
Elasticity and activity. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of the pumps in the membranes that are embedded in the membranes actually are driven by the Brownian action of the fatty acid molecules themselves,
Hmm.
which is something I only learned recently. I interviewed Tony Hulbert, who's a zoologist and an expert on animal membranes, and he explained that you can take, for instance, a sodium pump out of one organism where it runs at a certain rate, put it in another organism with a different fatty acid composition in the membranes, and it'll run at the rate of that organism based on the fats that are in the membranes.
Oh, wow. Interesting. And so polyunsaturated fats, these are fatty acids with multiple double bonds, hence the name polyunsaturated. Um, these are in all sorts of foods. Seed oils are a big example. How
All
would
foods,
yeah,
essentially all
I mean,
foods.
yeah, the vast majority. How would a typical mainstream American physician trained at an American university or, a member of the American Heart Association, how would they talk about polyunsaturated fats and human health today?
Oh, they would tell you that they're great for you.
Because what would be the reasoning there?
And the reasoning, well, specifically the the American Heart Association, came up with a hypothesis back in the 1950s. Well, let me rephrase that. They observed that if you fed people or animals omega-6 fatty acids, that it would drive their cholesterol down. And they had a hypothesis that cholesterol is what drove heart disease, which had just become a major problem in the United States. And their idea was that if you took increasing amounts of omega-6 fats, this would lower your cholesterol and thereby lower your rates of heart disease, right? That message has been consistently promulgated by the American Heart Association and by the medical establishment ever since the late 1950s.
Okay, so the basic idea is serum cholesterol levels are bad if they get too high because we think that's what's primarily driving cardiovascular disease. Eating polyunsaturated fats will bring those numbers down. It does, in fact, do that. And therefore, eating them is good and heart healthy. And that's why you see things like the American Heart Association Heart Healthy check mark on so many boxes of foods that have polyunsaturated fats.
That's right. That's right. And the problem with that messaging is that the American Heart Association went to great effort to try and prove experimentally that that was the case. Now, I mean, you have to understand that they're prescribing this as a drug, right? I mean, we now have refined fish oil products that are prescribed as drugs by physicians to prevent cardiovascular disease. The American Heart Association, starting in the late 1950s, and some of the fellows associated with it tried to demonstrate that this change would prove beneficial for cardiovascular disease, and they were unable to do so. All the longer term attempts, all of their attempts except for one, showed that consuming more seed oils resulted in higher levels of cardiovascular disease. The one that was neutral was too short term to show any effect at all. So unfortunately, they never came around and said, okay, we tried this and it didn't work. They kind of changed their message to say, okay, well, polyunsaturated fats in general are good for you. And by that, they included omega-3 fats in fish oil, right? Which is true. Unfortunately, that's not what people eat. The average American eats a 20 to 30 to 1 ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fats.
And that's just a natural consequence of the fact that seed oils and other processed foods contain primarily omega-6 fats because, for reasons maybe we can get into, but I don't think we need to. It's just economical for them to do it. Those are the mass-produced oils that make all these foods so cheap. It's part of why they're so plentiful.
They're cheap fats. That's exactly right. And that's why they got into the food supply in the first place.
Yeah.
Just because they were cheap, not because anybody thought there was any health benefit to them. Which is fair enough.
Sure.
We're all in favor of less expensive food. So
it's just because
assuming it's healthful.
People like a good deal, so naturally they're going to buy the things that are cheaper. And it's certainly a convenient story if the economically cheap ingredient is also quote unquote heart healthy. And it's not difficult to imagine why some of those narratives congealed.
Right. So then, so now we're in a position where, contrary to what the American Heart Association will say, that the only demonstrated path to cardiovascular disease in the literature is via oxidized omega-6 fats. Omega polyunsaturated fats in general are very susceptible to oxidation because of the double bonds you mentioned before, which means an oxygen atom can get in there and break the fat apart. And some of these oxidized fats, and I don't know how much detail you want to get into on that front, are extremely toxic, and damage all manner of things in the body, other lipids, proteins, DNA. You know, it can
Is
be
it fair?
quite a mess.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I do want to get into this in some detail. So just to get people prepared for some of that, like we just think of this on a very basic level, everyone understands basically that antioxidants are generally thought of as good things because oxidation is bad. And so
Right.
basically reactive oxygen species are formed and they can damage things in the body. So it's basically a way to damage stuff in your body. And antioxidants would be things that sort of absorb those free radicals and prevent them from damaging things.
They block the oxidative process in some way. Either they protect against it or they stop it from propagating. Because much like, if you put a match to a pool of gasoline, you wouldn't expect that little flame to sit in one corner. It's going to spread throughout the gasoline. Well, your body can suffer a similar process where one oxidized fat can oxidize the adjacent fat, can oxidize the adjacent fat, and you wind up with this self-propagating reaction that will continue until it's either runs out of fuel or is blocked by antioxidants.
So if the degree of unsaturation of a fat increases the number of points on which it can be oxidized, that means that the more polyunsaturated fats in the body, the larger the total supply of points that can be oxidized. You're basically,
that's right.
That would be like the fuel source to the fire. So if you light a flame, the more points that can be oxidized, the more this chain reaction could spread.
Right. Exactly right.
And so what are some of these, I guess one thing I want to ask, there's a number of places I want to go here. So,
we got 2 hours.
Yeah, we got 2 hours. Let's start out by going with, so people are consuming a lot of omega-6 fatty acids today. You mentioned that the average American is somewhere between a 20 and 30 to 1 ratio of omega-6 to omega-3s. But let's just keep in mind right now, people are consuming a lot of these polyunsaturated fats. Right. Let's say that you change your diet. You stop consuming so many of the polyunsaturated fats, or someone starts consuming a lot more. How quickly will the fatty acid composition of your membranes and your body fat and things like that actually change from the diet? Does it start happening right away? Does it take a long time for those changes to actually incorporate throughout the body?
It happens very quickly, but it depends on the turnover of fats in the tissue and also the turnover of cells in a tissue, right? So, for instance, skin cells, we lose skin cells continuously. The average life of a skin cell, I think, is days. So fatty acids in your skin can turn over fairly quickly. I noticed a difference in weeks when I fixed my diet by removing seed oils. Red blood cells famously have a life of about 3 to 4 months. And some tissues, like depressingly, cartilage I've actually seen the half-life of cartilage being from 200 to 400 years.
Oh, wow.
In your body. So yes, you are not ever going to see your cartilage entirely turn over. So, which indicates that this can potentially be a very serious issue because it can affect tissues. And for instance, your heart is able to repair itself to some degree, but not entirely. Your brain is able to repair itself to some degree, but not entirely. So if we see damage to these tissues, it's potentially irreparable. They talk a lot about, in the literature, irreparable protein damage as a result of these processes, which I always find pretty depressing, but it's not quite as bad as they say. At least that's what my experience indicates to me.
So if the average American is getting a lot of omega-6s today, 20 to 30, roughly 20 to 30 to 1 ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s, and just a lot of polyunsaturated fat overall, A lot of this is just unknowing consumption. It's just in everything. It's hard to avoid unless you actively try to avoid it. And some of it's knowingly consumed because of the
It's heart
narrative,
healthy.
right, around this heart
Yeah.
healthy narrative. Um, how has the fatty acid profile of the human diet changed over time? People today versus people 50 or 100 years ago versus people 100,000 years ago.
Well, 100,000 years ago, we have speculation.
Mhm.
The data, the recorded data, starts in 1909 in the United States, which is when they started keeping track of these sorts of things.
Mhm.
Um, and since then, the level of omega-6 has gone from, they think, 2 to 8% on average. Some people have a lot higher levels of omega-6 in the diet. So that's fourfold. The entire American diet has seen a huge shift. Well, the entire world diet, we should say, has seen a huge shift over the last 100 years from being primarily based on animal fats as the fat source to primarily based on vegetable fats as the fat source. And that's, again, as we mentioned, primarily been the result of economics. Um, there's been what's called a nutrition transition in a lot of countries as they go from poor subsistence agriculture societies to wealthier industrial societies. There's a consistent change in diet that happens from high carbohydrate, low protein, low fat to higher protein, higher fat, and lower carbohydrate. And traditionally, in like the 1800s or prior, those fats would have come from animal sources. In the 20th century, they started primarily coming from vegetable sources.
Yeah, and it really did take off, in the 20th century. If you look at the
Yeah,
data, I did an episode with Oren Davinsky, who has a nice paper looking at how the composition of the food supply has changed since basically the late 1800s. And one of the most striking changes is this transition away from animal fats to plant fats, driven largely by industrial seed oil production,
right, right.
which translates to much higher polyunsaturated fat consumption at the expense of saturated fat consumption.
That's correct. Oh, and it's interesting because also when you look at that data, typically what you see is a big decline in saturated fats over the 20th century, and then a concomitant increase in polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats, because that's typically what the fats that are in vegetable oils.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And if
and
we
the
just
monounsaturated fats are an important part of this story.
Yeah, yeah. And if we just extrapolate backwards in time and then compare that to what we can surmise ancient hunter gatherers would have been eating, given what we think we know about their diet, and also by comparing it to what extant hunter gatherers eat, it just sort of generally paints this picture of, okay, ancestrally, for most of human history, the fatty acid profile of the human diet for most people in most places was very different than it is today, or what it became starting in certainly by the early 1900s.
Yeah, it would have had a lot more omega-3 fats in it, and we can talk about why that is, and a lot fewer omega-6 fats. Close to its thought a balance of 1 to 1.
And so let's
And
talk about
reminder, we're at 30 to 1 or 20 to 1, so that's a big difference from 1 to 1.
yeah, that's basically I mean, it's basically novel. At no point in human history would it likely have been anywhere close to what it is today, and started to become, roughly 100 years ago.
Correct, correct. I mean, seed oil consumption started in ancient India. It's thought around 5,000 years ago is the first evidence we have for domestication. And what's interesting is shortly after that, we see the first evidence of what we now call chronic diseases or diseases of civilization. So they seem to go hand in hand.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the omega 6s versus the omega 3s before discussing oxidation in more detail. So you've got a couple major types of polyunsaturated fatty acids, the omega 3 fatty acids, the omega 6 fatty acids. What are some of the key similarities and differences between them?
Well, as we mentioned, they tend to have. I mean, I find the easiest way to understand the different types of fats is to start with the saturated fat, right? it is saturated with hydrogen atoms, right? Every opportunity for a hydrogen atom to attach itself to this backbone structure of carbons has been taken up, right? Saturated with hydrogen. Monounsaturated means it's missing a hydrogen. Polyunsaturated means it's missing more than one hydrogen, right? Um, so, monounsaturated fats are oleic acid, commonly the one that's in the
Olive oil.
olive oil, thank you. And the polyunsaturated fats come from animal and plant sources. The plant sources tend to be short chain, right? So only 18 atoms, 18 carbon atoms. The animal sources tend to be longer than that. And as they get longer, they tend to have more and more polyunsaturated bonds, or more and more double bonds, missing more and more hydrogen atoms. And this makes them progressively more fragile, right? So looking at omega-6 and omega-3, the more bonds it has, the more likely it is to oxidize, because the more opportunities there is for an oxygen to come in and break that molecule apart. But what's fascinating if you're a nerd like me, is that although you would think that there wouldn't be much of a difference between these two classes of fats, there are striking differences between them, right? Especially in the types of products that are produced from them.
Yeah.
And typically the omega-6 fats are more associated with things that cause inflammation in the body.
Yeah.
And the omega-3 fats are more associated with processes that resolve inflammation in the body.
Yeah.
So the most pro-inflammatory fat in the body is arachidonic acid, which is a 20 carbon, 4 double bond fat on the omega-6 side of things. And that is a primary pro-inflammatory mediator in your body. Your body needs this, right? This is a good thing. And it's also an essential part of your developmental process, right? If a growing child is deficient in arachidonic acid, they're going to suffer all sorts of developmental deficiencies.
I think, one thing I like to emphasize for people is inflammation is good as long as it doesn't go haywire. You want your body to become inflamed when and where it needs to be to get rid of infections or clear out debris from tissue damage and things like that. And then you want it to shut off when the job is done. And that's actually why, in my view, the body's expecting the sort of something close to a 1-to-1 ratio of the omega-6s and omega-3s, because although they're very similar, they're sort of literally two sides of the same coin. The omega-6s are the precursors, to the molecules that instigate inflammation. And then the omega-3s are the precursors to the ones that shut off that response. And when they're in balance, the body is able to turn on and off inflammation in a precise and quote unquote intended manner.
Right. And, I pointed out arachidonic acid because I wanted to make the point that lots of people will claim that seed oils are not a problem, because if you give somebody more seed oils from a common level, from the currently consumed level, their arachidonic level will not go up. But that misses the point that the shorter chain fats can also kick off an oxidative process, right? And that can happen independently of, arachidonic is stored throughout your body so that when you have a need for inflammation, because as you said, it's a beneficial process, you need inflammation, right? Drugs like steroids, for instance, that block the arachidonic acid cascade are very helpful if you have too much inflammation. But one of the side effects is that you tend to get infections and cancer, because it doesn't have your body doesn't have this inflammatory tool that it needs to prevent, infections and cancers. So, but this inflammation can get kicked off even without the use of arachidonic acid in the body. Simple, the short chain fat that's commonly found in seed oils, linoleic acid, can also oxidize into pro-inflammatory mediators, and can also cause damage through that pathway in the body, regardless of whether or not your body wants that source of inflammation.
And is there a clear-cut relationship? Has it been clearly measured that the higher the omega-6 consumption, the higher the omega-6 content of the fatty acid content of the body, and the higher levels of just background chronic inflammation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what my favorite study along those lines is they looked at mortality in an intensive care unit. People who can't eat are often given what's known as parenteral nutrition, which is an IV feed, which is typically glucose and a fat. And what they've mostly used is soybean oil.
Mm.
And so what happens when you pump people full of soybean oil? Well, it turns out that they had a 9 to 7 times higher mortality rate.
Then who were they compared to?
They were comparing them to people who were either just receiving glucose or were receiving nothing at all.
Oh, wow.
And we have decades of evidence of, looking at the fatty acid composition of different nutrition products and the beneficial or negative effects that they have in the body. So now, one of the interesting things about omega-6 fats and omega-3 fats typically have more double bonds and are therefore typically more susceptible to oxidative damage. But the things that are produced from the omega-6 fats tend to be much less toxic, or from the omega-3 fats tend to be much less toxic in the body, right? So that's an important factor that's not often considered in evaluating where you ought to be on this spectrum, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
if you if you put a kid on one of these soybean oil feeds, they will often get liver failure fairly quickly and die. It'll progress to either they'll need a liver transplant or they'll get liver cancer and they will die in short order. If you switch them from an omega-6 fat to an omega-3 fat like fish oil, it will not only can they survive for years on that and be perfectly healthy, but it will, if you give it early enough, cure the liver failure and reverse it.
And do we know how that failure is? I mean, I would imagine, the natural thinking would be the omega-6s are becoming oxidized. Some of those oxidative byproducts are damaging the liver. Has that been worked out? What the
Oh yeah,
actual
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's a nice demonstration, something that we can all relate to. They put people on a fish oil supplement, since most Americans don't get enough omega-3 fats. And then they expose their skin to ultraviolet radiation. And they measured the lipid peroxidation that was happening in the skin under UV light. And they had more UV light, but they had less of a sunburn as a result of having more omega-3 fats in their body.
Wait, this was done in humans.
In humans. Because the toxins that are produced in the oxidation of omega-6 fats are much more damaging to the body than the ones that are produced from omega-3 fats.
I see. What are some of these toxic byproducts that come from omega-6s?
The most studied is called 4-hydroxynonenal. HNE is what it's usually. And that's kind of neat because it has the equivalent omega-3 product is called 4-hydroxyhexanol, or HHE, right? So HNE is, for reasons I don't pretend to understand, significantly more toxic in the body than HHE is. And there are literally, there's an unknown number of things that these break down into because they are typically highly reactive and, a lot of them are different. For instance, HNE is very difficult to measure because it's so reactive. Generally, what they do is they measure things that it has damaged.
I see.
To get an idea of how much of it is in the body, because you can't just,
Yeah. It's almost like literally like lighting something on fire. Like there's a bunch of stuff combusting, right. It's turning into this, that, and the other, and then damaging things. So for HNE, the things that are instigating the damage are very ephemeral when they get produced.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And that's one that's got a better balance between stability and damage. There are more damaging products, but they're more damaging because they're more reactive, which means they're harder to measure.
So they did this experiment where they exposed people's skin to UV light, And what varied was the omega-3 fatty acid content. The people
Right.
that had higher omega-3 fatty acid content could basically tolerate more UV light before getting a visible sunburn.
That's correct.
So
And
is that just like what? Let's extrapolate this out. What is the implication there, and do we know more
well,
about that?
I mean, an interesting point to make um, is that your tissues tend to prefer omega-3 fats to omega-6 fats. So if they have the opportunity to incorporate omega-3 fats, they will do that preferentially. So in the skin, if you give it, your body will use it, take it up, distribute it out. And, um, this has effect on vision, on neurological function. And it apparently relates back to the fact that these more polyunsaturated fats are much more active in the membranes, so they produce better function when they're in the membranes. And when they get oxidized, because all of these fats invariably will get oxidized just under use, what they're producing is much less damaging to the body
Hmm.
than the omega-6 fats. So, in skin, you asked me the question about what are the things, skin tissue turnover and how long does it take to start seeing an effect? The first thing that I noticed was I became more resistant to sunburn.
Interesting. Because so the idea is skin turns over quickly. The cells are dividing on a day-to-day basis. Therefore, if you shift the fatty acid profile of your diet, the skin cells will be some of the first to see a shift in their lipid profile.
That's exactly right. That's
So,
exactly right.
what did you notice exactly?
So I had read fairly recently before trying this account, and I can provide a list of all this stuff just in case anybody wants to go look it up. But it was this account on one of the paleo sites, Mark's Daily Apple, Mark Sisson's old site, but an account by this guy who talked about all the positive things that he saw when he went on a paleo diet. And one of the things that he said was, I became resistant to sunburn. And I was like,
That's
that's
yeah, it does. It
ridiculous.
sounds ridiculous.
Yeah, it sounds ridiculous, right? So,
Mhm.
okay. I mean, I was extremely susceptible to sunburn. 45
Mhm.
minutes in the sun would make me a tomato.
Yeah.
It was a problem my entire childhood. And, so anyway, so I was out skiing in, I think, April, and it was a sunny day, and I hate sunscreen, so I hardly ever use it. And, I came back that day and I was like, huh, look, I didn't get a sunburn today. That's kind of interesting. And I didn't really think all that much of it.
Hmm.
Um,
So you're the type of person who would normally you go out skiing, it's sunny outside, but then you've also got the snow reflecting a lot of that light back to you, and you would get a like a wintertime sunburn.
yeah, I'd get a burn. And so, okay, well, that's interesting, but there's a lot of stuff going on, it doesn't really mean anything. So a couple of weeks, probably a month later, 3 or 4 weeks later, my now ex-wife and I, who was Colombian and had dark skin, went to an event outside in New York City and stood side by side in the sun for 2.5 hours, right?
Continuously.
Yeah. It was a barefoot running seminar led by this guy, Ted McDonald. So we were out there. Trees hadn't leafed out at this point. There was nowhere to stand. We were outside running up and down the sidewalks and everything. Um, Pretty good experiment, right? We had two people, one person susceptible to sunburn, one less susceptible to sunburn. And
And she was not. So at this point, you had cut out seed oils almost entirely, and she had not.
she had not, right? Um, so when we got home that evening, she looked at me and she said, "Look at me, I got a burn." And I
Where was
looked,
the burn?
it was on her face and her neck.
Okay. Yep. The places that were exposed all day.
Right, the places that were exposed. And I looked at myself and I said, I didn't get a burn. I was
Yeah, and
like,
yeah, I mean,
wait a minute here.
you're definitely light skinned. What's your background? What's your like ethnic background?
English, Irish, and German.
Yeah. So
Um, Yeah,
exactly.
so no olive skin in my
Yeah, yeah.
ancestry, sadly. Um, so I was like, well, this is, wait a minute.
Hmm. Hmm.
But this was what Stefan had described in the post. This was the reason
Hmm.
that I had stopped these things in the
Uh,
first place. And I went back and I reread that post by the guy who talked about how his sunburn went away. And I was like, well, this is really interesting. So a
yeah.
little while,
And the idea here isn't that. So let's just assume this is true and reproducible, and we can talk about if that's been done next. But I don't think you're saying that you're immune to sunburn. It's that you can
no,
tolerate more sunlight before you do get
right.
sunburned.
That's correct. Yes. I am not immune to sunburn. I have posted pictures to Twitter of sunburns that I have gotten. Typically now, I will get a burn if I'm out for a long period of time, right at the beginning of the year before I start getting any sun exposure, and whatever pitiful amount of melanin my body can produce has had the opportunity to appear.
Hmm.
But also typically, you know, prior that would have happened in 45 minutes or so. Now
Yeah,
it's 5, 6, 7 hours, right?
yeah,
So it's a
um,
big difference. And
yeah.
then later on in the summer, I mean, I've done backpacking trips in the Idaho desert where I'm out for 5 or 6 days and I never get a sunburn, right?
Yeah.
I will get sensitive at the end of the day, but by that point, I've exposed myself to the sun. I've gotten a bit of a tan, and I can be out for days and, not get a sunburn. I'll get pink the first day, and then I'll start getting a tan.
Yeah. And one thing I want to emphasize is something I learned from discussion on a previous episode with a photobiomodulation expert is that um, everyone knows that UV light is the primary driver of sunburn. It does mutate your DNA. It is carcinogenic.
Yep.
Sunscreen blocks out UV light. It does not block out other wavelengths of light. And the reason that's important is that there's a lot of oxidative damage or stress that can be induced by other wavelengths of light, including in the visible spectrum. So if you put on
Right.
sunscreen, for example, you are blocking out the UV light, which is good because it's decreasing the amount of DNA damage that your body will take on. But you're actually enabling yourself to go out into the sun for longer, which means you'll get more oxidative stress from the other wavelengths of light that you would have gotten if you had been out in the sun for a lesser amount of time. And then, sort of, if we match that with all the things that you've just started telling us, if you have a body that's rich in these omega-6 fatty acids, you are sort of increasing how much oxidative damage you'll take on in total. Like this, the substrate for oxidative stress is maximized in someone who has a lot of omega-6s in their diet.
That's correct. And this is specific to blue light, right? Um, Wavelengths up to blue light are sufficient to cause omega-6 fats to oxidize in your body.
Hmm.
And blue light is associated with the primary cause of blindness in the United States, which is age-related macular degeneration,
Hmm.
which is one of the few medical conditions where when you go read the literature, they will say you predispose yourself to this by consuming too much linoleic acid, not enough omega-6 fats, or not enough omega-3 fats, and that a high intake of omega-3 and reducing omega-6 is protective.
Wow.
So, yeah, if you put sunscreen on and you're out all day and you're not wearing blue light blocking sunglasses, you are going to be blasting your retina with blue light and oxidizing those fats.
Oh wow. And do you know much about the sunglasses and how common it is for them to block out that blue light?
I don't, but back when I was super sun sensitive, I was very sensitive to my eyes. Even in high school, I was prescribed photosensitive glasses because my eyes were so sensitive. And nowadays, I don't even like wearing sunglasses because it blocks out so much light. And I feel my vision's much better when I don't wear them. And unless I'm looking like straight into the sun, like if I'm riding a motorcycle towards the sun or I'm on snow, in the winter where you're getting light from above and reflected light, I I don't like wearing them anymore. I mean, it's really like I feel like I can't see, whereas it used to be a requirement. My eyes would be in pain after an hour or so out in the sunlight.
Um, and so Can you talk a little bit about, so you have been on this low omega-6 diet. You've been avoiding seed oils and things with omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids for a number of years now. What does that
Since
actually look like?
2009.
Okay. What does that look like in practice? What are you avoiding and what are you eating?
Well, I avoid seed oils, which means salad dressings. That was my real downfall
I see.
prior to fixing my diet. I had, in my 20s, figured out that fried foods were so bad for me that I couldn't eat them except for occasionally. Especially like deep fried breaded stuff. I just couldn't eat that at all. Um, but the salad dressings were a real problem. Most processed foods at this point have had the saturated animal fats replaced with vegetable fats.
Yeah.
And industrially fed animals like chicken or pork
Yep.
are typically pretty high in omega-6 fats because that's what they're fed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And animals, ruminants are protected against, to some extent, omega-6 fats by the bacteria in their rumen, the microbiome in their rumen, whereas monogastric animals with a single stomach, like chicken, pork, chicken, pigs, or people, we just absorb it directly from the
Mhm.
diet. There's nothing
So,
to protect
yep.
us.
So do you avoid chicken and pork completely, or do you simply avoid the fat on that meat?
Oh, hold on, sorry. Um, just turn that off. Sorry about that. I forgot to do that. Um, I I'll eat chicken. I eat chicken eggs pretty regularly. I try and get pastured ones, and I
Yep.
hope that they have a
That's what I
better
do.
fatty acid composition, although I've never seen a measurement of it. There was a study done in Israel where they looked at farm-raised eggs versus conventional eggs, and the conventional eggs pretty quickly raised the level of oxidized fats in the body, whereas the farm-raised eggs didn't.
Hmm.
Omega-3 eggs, which I haven't seen on the market in quite some time, used to be an option where they were feeding, because chickens are pretty good about, you know, uptake of omega-3 fats and upsizing it into the longer chain fats that we need. Um, virtually never eat industrial eggs. I mean, unless I go out to a restaurant. And then, I'll try and ask them to cook it in butter and not cook it in seed oils.
Hmm.
I I make sure I eat a lot of beef, lamb, fish. I love fish. I also love things that a lot of people don't like that makes this a lot easier, like liver and
Mm.
sardines. Um, so it's,
Hmm. And
uh,
do you know what your omega-6 3 ratio is? Have you gotten that tested?
I haven't. I'm not a big, I did a lot of testing when I started doing this, and I kind of figured out what drives things and then stopped worrying about it, right? Once
Yeah.
I saw
Yeah.
things go the way that I expected them to,
Yeah.
I said, okay, well, if I keep the inputs correct, then the outputs should be fine. And, I have enough biomarkers of making mistakes, and it happens to me quickly enough that, I don't really need a longer term test to tell me
Yeah.
if I'm
Yeah.
eating too much.
Well, just for those listening, like just to give you one data point, I actually just this week got my first lipid full sort of omega fatty acid lipid profile
Omega
test
Quant.
back. Yeah, it was the omega quant,
Okay.
and as someone who's pretty good about thinking about seed oils and things, I'm not going to say I'm not totally neurotic, but I'm fairly neurotic about it. I'm at a 4-to-1, 6-to-3 ratio.
Okay. Which is pretty
And
good.
yeah, that's not bad. That's probably a lot better than the average person. But that was my first data point. I didn't know how close to 1-to-1 I was going to be, 10-to-1, 5-to-1, whatever, and I came back at
Right.
4-to-1.
Yeah, the best I've seen, there's a guy who keeps a database of this, and the best he's ever seen is 1.5 to 1,
Hmm.
1.5 to 1. And that was a guy who avoids seed oils diligently and eats a lot of fish and stuff. But what's important to note about this is that, you know, back to the beginning of the conversation, virtually every food that you eat, even foods that you don't think of as fatty, are going to
Hmm.
contain omega-3 and omega-6 fats, right?
Yes.
That's perfectly normal. So you don't want to go nuts trying to avoid these things, right?
Yeah.
You want to, I think, try and avoid concentrated
Yeah.
sources.
Well, speaking of
But
nuts.
but yeah, well, let's but if you are eating things, if you are eating a lot of vegetables and you're eating a lot of non-fatty meats or not, non-industrially raised meats, you can get your omega-3 fat levels up pretty high without taking any omega-3 supplements or eating fish, just
Hmm.
because there seems to be some sort of collateral damage that happens when your omega-6 fat consumption goes up. It brings down your omega-3 levels.
Hmm.
And if you lower your omega-6 fat consumption, your omega-3 fat levels will go up. And I know a physician who is able to get everything in the green on the omega quant test without supplementing or eating fish, just by eating, you know,
Cutting out
a
the
just
omega
by cutting
6.
out, just by
Yeah.
cutting out, which is, I think, back to the evolutionarily expected inputs. Most people didn't live near the ocean and didn't
Mm.
live in areas where
Yeah.
they could eat lots of fish,
Yeah, that's a
right?
good point.
Even looking at Africa, most of Africa is not on a shoreline, and Africa's a plateau. So it's actually, if you're living in the middle of Africa, you're not going to be able to eat a lot of seafood, especially before the modern era. I mean,
Hmm.
there's a tiny band of around the perimeter of Africa where people are going to be able to eat a lot of fish. And that's not where we evolved. We evolved in the middle, up on the highlands. So it makes sense that through eating wild game that's going to have a better omega-3 fatty acid balance, you ought to be able to get enough of it to be a human.
Hmm. Interesting. So I want to talk a little bit more about oxidation and stuff. So the fatty acids can become oxidized in your body. They can also
Right.
be oxidized before you put them in their body. Maybe to talk about this, can you start off by just telling the story about how places like McDonald's changed how they fried their fast food, and then get into a discussion about fully oxidized fats that we consume when they're already
Yeah.
that oxidized?
So McDonald's famously used to use beef tallow for their French fries. And apparently they were magnificent. I don't remember that, but whatever. And then in the 1990s, the vegan animal rights group PETA and it's some of its related groups pressured them into switching from tallow to, I think they were using some sort of shortening, which means lots of trans fats,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Oops. Um, and then I think it was the early 2000s when they started I think it was actually in the 1990s when industry started realizing the trans fats were harmful, and industry was way ahead of governments in reacting to this. And Cargill, who is one of, if not the largest producers of vegetable oils in the world, went to McDonald's and said, you guys need to stop using shortening and trans fats. We think they're going to get banned and they're probably harmful to people. And we have a solution for you. It's a low linoleic acid rapeseed oil, right?
Hmm.
Type of canola oil. And this will be beneficial because it's low in linoleic acid, and so it's much less susceptible to oxidation, right? Because not only is oxidation harmful to your body, but it also makes for a crappy eating experience when you are cooking, right? When fats go rancid, they become bitter. They're beneficial. It's fascinating. There are actual flavorings that are used in industry that are oxidized omega-6 fats, but there are also bitter ones that they don't use for flavoring. So there's a whole culinary aspect to rancid fats that we don't typically think about, right?
Hmm.
So anyway, they then convinced McDonald's, oh, you don't want to use high linoleic fats, you want to use lower linoleic fats. And you can find in the literature papers looking at French fries fried in various different oils, and they track it by typically looking at 4-H&E, and they'll note that, this is a toxic byproduct and it probably has toxic effects when it gets into the human body, and we'd be best to avoid this. So, yeah, kind of a
And
problem.
yeah, so just like basically these omega sixes, just they got into everything over the years.
Right.
This just being one example. So what sorts of, so when someone eats McDonald's French fries, so basically my understanding is they put the fries into the fryer. It's filled with some kind of seed oil essentially, and they're
Right.
boiling them in it, and these oils are recycled, so it's like they're used over and over and over again. So they're basically that
Right.
what they're being boiled in is fully oxidized and filled with presumably things like 4-H&E and all of this other stuff.
Yeah. I mean, you can track it when yeah, that's exactly right. Fryers in restaurants, they typically do multiple batches of French fries in them.
Mhm.
Each batch of French fries causes additional oxidation to the oils. There's lots of papers tracking the amount of linoleic acid and the rise of these toxic metabolites. There's a whole range of them that they can look at.
Mhm.
And, it's clear that repeated use, breaks down the linoleic acid and increases all this stuff.
And I would
In
presume it's worse for your health to ingest these fully oxidized things rather than consuming fresh omega 6s that then become oxidized in your body.
Yeah, yes, definitely. They're toxic, right? Full stop. I'm not being hyperbolic here.
Yeah.
That's how they're described in the literature, or you can go read the Wikipedia page for 4-HNE, and it's a toxin. It is toxic to your body. Um, the interesting question when I first heard about this, does it also happen in the body, right?
Mm.
And we know that it does. Now, they've done a lot of work looking at oxidation of linoleic acid in the body. And linoleic acid is in some tissues preferentially incorporated into your mitochondria,
Hmm.
right? Where it is very susceptible to oxidation because the mitochondria is basically a little, furnace
Yeah. Yeah.
burning fats and sugars in a very controlled manner to produce energy, right? And it's not a perfectly clean burn. There are, things that get out that can damage fats. And when you have a high concentration of linoleic acid, you're very susceptible to this damage. And one of the things that is produced from oxidized linoleic acid inside your mitochondria is 4-HNE. And they can measure the damage both by measuring excretion of HNE. It's conjugated with mercapturic acid, and that's urinated out. They can measure protein carbonyls, right, which is proteins that have been modified. They can measure DNA damage markers. They can measure decreased levels of antioxidants like glutathione. So yeah, it's clear that, not only is this process happening in production of vegetable oils, during cooking with vegetable oils, but it's also happening in the body, even if you eat theoretically a pure oil, right?
Mhm.
Linoleic acid can be catalyzed into oxidation by iron, right? Which we don't have any iron in our bodies. That's a joke. We have lots of iron in our bodies, right? In the mitochondria, um, linoleic acid is bound to a molecule that contains an iron atom. And when it's bound to linoleic acid, it will actually alter its structure and expose the iron atom, thus creating an oxidative reaction.
Hmm. I would imagine the blood would be an important place for this as well.
Blood, it's interesting. The heme molecules are all produced by the mitochondria,
Mm.
right? So that process, I'm not sure about blood specifically happening, but the process is kicking off in the mitochondria. And, it's been clearly demonstrated that heme iron, both in the body and in the gut, for instance, if you consume polyunsaturated fats and heme fat, heme iron at the same time. Like, say, a McDonald's hamburger and an order of fries, the heme will catalyze the oxidation of the polyunsaturated fats down in your gut, and they think that's what's driving colon cancer,
Hmm.
right? Because if you give the body the heme without the polyunsaturated fats, you don't get the the oxidation products that are catalyzed by the iron.
I see. I want to go back to nuts. How do you think
Nuts.
about nuts? Because there's lots of different nuts. A lot of them contain quite a bit of the omega-6 fatty acids. What's your relationship to nuts in your own diet? How do you think about it? What would you point out to people here?
I eat nuts. Let's get that out of the way. I even eat peanuts. Oh, I just found this out recently. This made me so happy. It turns out that Mars, the company that makes M&Ms, and specifically peanut M&Ms, switched to a low linoleic acid peanut a number of years ago, right? Why did they do this? It turns out that the shelf life of the low linoleic acid peanut M&M is 10 times that of a normal peanut, which is high in linoleic acid, right? Because it's less susceptible to oxidation, which makes
Wow,
it go rancid,
that
which is
makes
what
perfect
makes
sense.
food right.
Yeah.
So they're not doing it for the health benefit, but they're doing it because their
Shelf
peanuts will
life.
sit on the shelf 10 times as long.
Oh,
So
wow.
I am happy to report that peanut M&Ms are back on my menu if I want a treat or, a snack at a gas station. Um, but so most nuts, sadly, including peanuts, are high in
I
linoleic
see.
acid.
So when you said you eat peanuts, you are specifically eating low linoleic acid peanuts.
I'm specifically eating peanut M&Ms.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
If you go to a typical bag of peanuts is going to actually have a lot of linoleic acid.
Yes, sadly. And the one low linoleic acid nut naturally are macadamia nuts, which are also my
Mm.
favorite nuts. So when I originally fixed my diet, I ate a ton of macadamia nuts just because, that was like a great snack. Macadamia nuts and dark chocolate were how I got through the first year or two of doing this.
Hmm.
Um, there's a fantastic article by a doctor named Michael Eads that he wrote years ago called "Are Nuts Paleo?" And he talked about growing up on a farm in Arkansas, and they had a bunch of nut trees on the farm. And first off, nuts are seasonal, right? Everybody knows that. Acorns happen during a period in the year. Every other nut tree is like that, happens once a year for a couple of weeks. He also talked about how hard it was to get the nuts out of the shells, right? He would put them in a bag and run over them with his pickup truck. Okay. So, and his conclusion, and then he went through a whole bunch of charts looking at, how much omega-6 fat is in nuts versus other things that you might eat, like chicken or beef. And his conclusion, which I concur, is if you eat nuts like a caveman once in a while, once a year, you're probably going to be fine, right? But nuts are a highly processed food nowadays. That's how you can go to the supermarket and get walnuts all year long, right? They're shelled for you, they're
Yep.
roasted,
They're available all
they're
year, and you don't have to work to get out the food part.
bingo. So they're like the classic highly processed food that nobody thinks of as being
Yeah. Yeah.
a highly processed food.
Interesting. Okay.
So,
So when you say you eat nuts, you are specifically eating low linoleic acid nuts. You're not going and
or,
taking a mixed
I'll
nut.
have some walnuts once in a while
Sure. Sure.
and I won't sweat it, but it's not a
Yeah.
staple part of my
Yeah.
diet.
But like, I mean, a bag of mixed nuts that I can go get at the grocery store at Costco, that's a classic example of something that has the heart healthy sticker on it that most
Yep.
physicians probably would say is a great choice.
Right. And nuts are very nutritious. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
You know,
In other respects, yeah.
in other respects. And I mean, so we were discussing earlier, the American Heart Association and their recommendation that we eat seed oils for our heart health. And what they finally proved was that they demonstrated that linoleic acid lowers cholesterol. But what they also demonstrated was that the more it lowered your cholesterol, the worse result you had in terms of cardiovascular health,
Hmm.
right? The more likely you were to have a bad outcome and die,
Yeah.
right? So what are some other things that they recommend to lower your cholesterol level? Well, it's nuts. They have the same fat in them,
Hmm.
right? Even if it's not oxidized, it gets oxidized when
Yeah.
it's in your body.
Yeah. And most people have been so thoroughly inundated by the lipid heart hypothesis and the idea that more cholesterol is bad, less cholesterol is good, higher serum cholesterol is bad,
Right.
lower is good. But if you actually, in the data that I've seen in many papers, if you look at all cause mortality or cardiovascular mortality for different age and sex demographics, so men and women of different ages. For most of those groups, there is a U-shaped relationship between mortality and cholesterol levels, meaning
Right.
your risk of
Yes.
mortality goes up if it's too high or too low.
Or too low.
And
Right.
the lowest mortality risk tends to be for most of the demographics at a serum cholesterol level that's what most people would think of as being too high.
That's correct. Yes, I've seen the same thing.
Yeah.
And I'll also point out that, people. Oh, so to close off the nut topic. So, you know, we like to look at ancestral populations because they're typically not eating any processed foods. Are there any ancestral populations that eat a lot of nuts, and what do they look like,
Hmm.
right? Well, it turns out that the Bushmen in Africa eat a lot of a nut called the mongongo nut, which is high in linoleic acid.
Hmm.
And during mongongo nut season, they will fail a glucose tolerance test. And they also tend to have pot bellies. They don't get fat because they don't have enough calories available to them.
Yeah, but they get pot bellies and they
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 diabetes.
they get diabetes basically. So hold on. So when we think about diabetes, hold on, because when we think about sugar, right? Glucose causes insulin spikes. Fructose is processed in the liver that can also promote insulin resistance. Carbs, especially simple sugars, are what we think of when we think of diabetes and insulin resistance. But you're saying linoleic acid is important here?
Yes, that's a good point. If you want to give people insulin resistance experimentally, they do it by injecting soybean oil into their veins, right?
When and why does this happen?
This was first discovered in 1964 with parenteral nutrition, right? This fat emulsion that's used as parenteral nutrition was invented in 1961.
I
And by
see.
1964, they had figured out that when you give it to people, they would become insulin resistant and hyperglycemic.
Okay, so they're giving it to people who
So,
couldn't eat normally because they're in the
right,
hospital. They need some
right.
nutritious sludge pushed right into their bodies, into their GI tract that
And
happen to contain.
they saved a lot of lives by doing that. So let's
Yeah,
just be clear that that was a
yeah,
good
yeah,
innovation.
yeah, yeah.
And it was also much better than the cottonseed oil that they tried to use.
But you're saying
Um,
that they started noticing that these people would become diabetic at higher rates.
right, right. While they were on the infusion, it goes away when you stop the
How
infusion.
quickly is it going on and off?
It- so, if you take a bunch of the usual guinea pig of the medical school, the college student, the healthy college student, it happens within hours.
Really?
Um, within hours. And there
Meaning
was one
their insulin
study,
sensitivity is shifting.
right. And there was one study where they took a similar dose of soybean oil and gave it to them orally because they wanted to see if this was just an artifact of the IV infusion. And they also became insulin resistant in within 8 hours.
Hmm. So
So if you want to if you want a diet that, and I just looked at another one of these papers yesterday or 2 days ago that I put in a post. If you want a diet that's not going to cause insulin resistance, make it really high in sugar.
hmm?
Real high sugar diets don't cause insulin resistance.
Explain that to me.
They don't.
When you say high,
They
which sugar are you talking about? Glucose in particular?
sucrose.
Sucrose, just sugar. So that's glucose and fructose.
Yeah. So the study I was looking at the other day, and with your background, you'd actually find this really interesting. So a quick tangent here. So one of the big problems in the in science and diet is diets are pain, right? Especially when you're looking at fatty acids and you're trying to compare different fatty acids in the diet to each other. because generally what you have to do is you blend different oils to get the ratios of fatty acids that you want in the diet. And oils come with other things, right? I mean, fish oil typically is not refined. It's got other fishy products in it. Soybean oil has lots of polyphenols in it and sterols, the plant version of cholesterol. There's all these other things that can confuse your result. So this guy at Harvard, Jing Kang, came up with this brilliant idea that, animals, including all mammals, can't convert omega-3 fats, can't convert omega-6 fats to omega-3 fats, right? So both fats are essential. They're required for life, but they're separately essential. You can't interconvert them, right? But C. elegans, the famous roundworm that scientists love to work on because it's cheap and easy to feed and has a short lifespan, so you can do all sorts of fun experiments with it. It can convert omega-6 fats to omega-3 fats. So C. elegans always has a 1-to-1 ratio, regardless of what you feed them, because they can interconvert. So this genius, and I will use that word enthusiastically, he took what they call the FAT1 gene from C. elegans and put it in mice.
Yeah.
And then you can feed 2 sets of mice one diet, an identical diet, and one of them will convert half of the omega-6 to omega-3. So it will have a 50-50 ratio. And it's not 50-50s at an organismal level. Different tissues will have different levels.
Yeah.
It's a miracle to me that that actually happens when you put this gene in a mouse.
Yeah, yeah. And so what's the headline result there? Basically, how do those mice look compared to normal mice?
They're perfectly healthy. They've bred them for years, right? The gene sticks.
Yep.
They tend to be, they do better in regards to all the chronic diseases. If you put them on an obesogenic diet, which typically means a high linoleic diet, they are less likely to get obese and they're less likely to get insulin resistant than and the really cool thing about this is that you can take a male FAT1 mouse and a female regular mouse and cross them, and half the litter will have the FAT1 gene and the other half won't. So you simultaneously are eliminating diet and genes as variables, right? So they've discovered, so the study that I was looking at the other day, they took the standard obesogenic diet, which is called D12492, made by Research Diets. 18% linoleic acid. And it's, the number one diet for inducing obesity and insulin resistance in animals.
Yeah. And so that's underappreciated, I think, even among the scientists who do these experiments, because I used to be one of them. A lot of scientists just give they order the quote high fat diet. They don't even realize that it's high linoleic acid. Oftentimes it's basically made with a lot of soybean oil.
That's right. So, they still got fatter than, the mice who weren't given the high fat diet, because it was still, one of my open questions I have about this mice is how much are they actually converting, right? I don't think the conversion is happening in their stomach as they're digesting it. So
they still gain some weight, but I'm guessing not as much as the other mice.
Not as much. And, they had better glucose tolerance, blah, blah, blah. Everything was better.
So
but the funny part, and where I got to this little story, was the non-obesogenic diet was 45% sucrose.
Ooh. Oh, interesting.
Yes.
Oh, wow. So it's not
and
obesogenic.
The obesogenic diet was only 7% sucrose, but 18% linoleic acid.
So if the obesity-inducing diet was high in fat, in particular omega-6 fatty acid, linoleic acid, and fairly low in sugar, whereas the non-obesogenic diet was almost half sugar.
Right.
Wow.
Right. So now it seems that there's, so this is a classic confounder, because as you pointed out, and as I've seen a million times in papers, you order a bag of this stuff, you give it to the mice. And I've seen papers where they call it saturated fat, right? It's basically, if you look at the ingredients, it's a third saturated fat, a third monounsaturated fat, and a third linoleic acid, typically with trace amounts of omega-3 fats,
Yeah.
right? So you can't call it, it's mostly unsaturated fats. It's
Yes.
definitely not mostly saturated fats.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Now, so there's a question.
and just one last point
Yeah.
here. If you take the omega-6 fat level down in this diet to 1% and replace it with saturated fat, the obesogenic effect goes away.
So this is really pointing to linoleic acid.
Yeah.
You're gonna have to send me that one because I don't think I've looked at that. That's interesting.
Yeah. And that's been replicated multiple times.
Yeah. Wow. So what I mean, so one of the things here is okay, C. elegans has this genetic ability to keep its omega-3, omega-6 ratio 1-to-1. Mammals don't have this, so our ratios are determined by dietary intake. The question is like why, like if so many downstream negative effects come from deviating from that 1-to-1 ratio and having a skewed balance towards omega-6s, it's like why did our lineage mammals never evolve that or lose it? And the way that I think about that, having a background in evolutionary biology, is first, let me tell you another brief story to think by analogy. So humans don't produce vitamin C endogenously, humans and
Right.
certain other primates, but most mammals actually do. Your cat can survive without eating fruit because its body just makes the vitamin C it needs. And there's a gene that does that. There's an enzyme that makes vitamin C somehow. I forget the details. Most mammals have the endogenous vitamin C production, so they don't have to worry about ingesting vitamin C through diet. Our lineage that led up to us lost that ability. It's like, why on earth why would an organism lose an ability like that that seems so useful? And the answer it has to do with the what's in your environment consistently.
Right.
The lineage that led to fruit
after the answer being bad luck.
Yeah. Right. So in the lineage that gave rise to us and other like frugivorous primates,
frugivorous. Now that's
yes.
a word you snuck in there. That means we ate a lot of fruit. So
yes.
It wasn't a problem that we couldn't make vitamin C.
Exactly. So the primates that eventually became us were eating so many things with vitamin C that if a mutation happened to render that gene dysfunctional that made vitamin C endogenously, it didn't matter because they were essentially just getting that from the environment. And so things are enabled to be lost in evolution in that way. And I wonder, I'm speculating here, I don't know if this is the case. I wonder if something like that happened at some point in animal evolution where the omega-6-3 content of the world around us and the foods that mammals were eating was such that, it didn't deviate that much, it didn't skew that much. And so maybe that ability was lost at some point.
Well, it's interesting. When I talked to Tony Hulbert, he calls omega-3 fats, he calls them leaf fats, and omega-6 fats, he calls seed fats. Because in a plants can make both of them.
Yeah.
But they tend to have the omega-3 fats in their leaves and the omega-6 fats in their seeds.
Yeah.
And I asked him why that might be, and he couldn't really answer. But when I look through the literature, I regularly come over papers about the toxicity of linoleic acid in a plant context.
I wonder if this relates back to our sunscreen conversation. Even though plants,
it could well. Yes, that it's producing more toxic things under UV light and visible light than omega-3 fats, and therefore, why is it getting segregated into the seeds though? I mean, there's potential. I don't. I mean, anyways, seeds. You do see so that anyway, the segregation is happening in plants, right?
Yeah.
Which we all depend on. All animals depend on plants for everything that we get, essentially. But you would be getting a balance, right? Until the modern era when you could start refining seeds. If you look at most traditional diets, people eat leaves, they eat seeds when they're in season. They're eating animals that are eating the same thing. They're never going to get too. I mean, I've seen the evolutionary ratio from like 1-to-1 to 3-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3. You never really get outside of that range. And people seem to do fine. Like you're 4-to-1. I wouldn't, or 4.5-to-1, you said.
I think it was 4.1-to-1.
Yeah. So I wouldn't sweat that too much. I mean, it'd be nice to get it down to the correct level, but, I wouldn't, eat nothing but fish to get to that level, for instance, or something.
So how I just want to ask some just very general questions. So, given your trajectory as an individual independent scholar and the little experiments you've done in your own life with your diet, based on your reading of the literature and what you've found over the years and how you've found it, and comparing all that to what's the average person is going to get their information not from reading the literature, not from doing the types of things that someone like you did. They're going to just be listening to their doctor. They're going to be looking for the American Heart Association recommendations. They're going to be following the mainstream guidelines. What's your general view on why those guidelines and that mainstream information seem to deviate so much from what people like you find and what certain researchers doing scientific work seem to find?
That's a very hard question. Um, I've, I mean, there's certainly, now we're getting into psychology,
Yeah. Yeah.
psychiatry, and
Let me try and
human
rephrase that
nature.
in maybe a simpler way. How do you individually, how do you determine who to listen to and who not to listen to?
I check facts. I'm anal about fact checking things. Even people I like, when they tell me things, I go, really? Interesting. And it's something that I learned when I was learning technology. Um, you know, there was a moment where early in my career where I'd hired a company to install a firewall, and they sent this guy, and he didn't, and he came in on a Saturday so it wouldn't interrupt the business. And turns out he really didn't know what he was doing. And I didn't know what I was doing either. So that was a problem. But I'm a speed reader. So while he was futzing around with this thing, trying to figure it out, I read the 120-page long manual for how to program a Cisco PIX. And then when I finished, I said to him, okay, I'm going to program it now. And I did the installation and programmed it. And, that was the end of that. So that was a good lesson that you really need to not trust people. You need to be able to, and you can't always do this. It can drive you bananas, but you need to be able to do that. And you have to recognize, back to the question you asked about physicians, looking specifically at the AHA. When the AHA in the 1950s and 60s started recommending that people do this, one of the founders of the AHA was this guy, Paul Dudley White. And his comment was, he was one of the first cardiologists in the country. And when he was in medical school, nobody got heart disease and nobody ate seed oils knowingly, right? It wasn't on the market. And his comment to them was, well, if these are essential for protection from heart disease, then why did nobody eat them when nobody had heart disease in this country? Right? They are institutionally so into this that it would just be incredibly damaging to their credibility if they turned around and said, oh, we've been wrong for the last 70 years. And Lord knows how many people have gotten heart attacks because of our bad advice and because of us ignoring the research that we did to show that this was beneficial, right? And I think, unfortunately, you know, that's a tough line to sell to people. People like their doctors, they respect their doctors, and they want to think that their doctors have their best interests in mind and are immune to all the human failures that we're all subject to, right? Whether you're a scientist or a doctor or a priest or anybody else. Um, Fortunately, and I don't know what your views are on the COVID stuff, but it's since become more and more clear that there was a lot of malfeasance during that period. And I think people are recognizing that they shouldn't have, that they, how should we say this, should be more skeptical about the advice that they're getting than they would have been prior to that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
Yeah,
I'll
yeah,
also point out that, I mean, practically speaking, if you cut back on your seed oil intake, you're not going to do yourself any harm.
yeah, yeah. What so one question I have, one thing I've been thinking about is when you look at the diet world, broadly speaking, that ranges from people who are sort of in the science, doing the science, or directly connected to it, like you, reading the literature, to the average person who just has opinions they form about the diet that they've embraced. You often find that people have an almost religious devotion to whatever diet group they've attached themselves to. Whether it's vegans, whether it's, some people talk about seed oil crusaders, some people talk about, people get really into whatever the diet is that they attach themselves to, it
Seed oil
seems.
zealot is the term I prefer.
Seed oil zealot. Do you recognize that quality out there? And if so, why do you
Oh,
think people get so almost ideological about diet?
oh, for sure. I, you know, well, we need to observe that the profession of dietitian and a large part of the nutrition science, scientific infrastructure that we have was an offshoot of a religious cult, the Seventh Day Adventists, right? The woman who founded the profession of dietitian, Lena Horne, I think it is. I'll have to double check her name. Was a one of the original Seventh Day Adventist dietary um, missionaries, right? We currently have a self-described Adventist dietary missionary on, I think he's actually aged out, but on the Dietary Guideline Scientific Committee
Hmm.
now.
Who,
And
who are or were the Seventh Day Adventists? What do they believe, and where do they come from?
well, I don't think you can call them Christian anymore, but they started off as a Christian sect. They were founded by this woman, Ellen White, and she decided over a number of decades that you know, a vegetarian diet was what God wanted us to eat. And, that was the best thing for health. I mean, that's where breakfast cereal comes from, right? Kellogg was a Seventh Day Adventist, and the Kellogg Cereal Company in Battle Creek, Michigan, was a sanitarium that they set up. They're the second biggest operators of hospitals in the world after the Catholic Church. And they are huge participants in medical education around the world. They have their own medical school. But then you have places like the, Harvard School of Public Health, which is closely aligned with the Adventists. I don't know if they're Adventists or not, but they do a lot of research projects together promoting a vegetarian or a vegan diet. So that's one reason why diet can also often feel like it's part of a cult. I don't know, you know, I think it's just back to psychology, psychiatry, and human nature. I think that most people have a spot in their brain for a religion. And if there's nothing in there, then they will create something, right? And they'll latch on to any pattern of, you know, ritual and belief that makes them think that they're feeling better. Um, I mean, to go through evolutionary biology, there are lots of reasons to think that religions are pro-survival, which is why all human populations have religions. And
Yes.
up until, the modern era, there are no atheist societies. So there's clearly, even though we may not understand it or may disagree about it, there's clearly some survival benefit going on there
Yeah, I
for
think
it to
that's an
be
important point.
ubiquitous.
Yeah, if something that expensive to run lasts that long and
And is that
persists this
prevalent?
long, it has some kind of adaptive function it's serving.
Right. So, so yeah, I think people, you know, we're back to human nature again. People are disappointing in so many ways.
But yeah, I mean, most people still don't know this. Like a lot of a lot of the foods that we consume, like Kellogg's breakfast cereal, a lot of the dietary movements were literally founded by religious cults.
Right. Right. Right.
And they're very influential. This is not fringe, right? This is like,
Right.
you mentioned how influential they are in operating hospitals, and Kellogg's is not some small company in the woods of Michigan. It's everywhere.
Yeah. And we have, this guy, on the Dietary Guidelines Committee, who is a self-described, um, and I can't remember his name right now. I'll send it to you so you can. He wrote a paper bragging about the impact that the Adventist Church has had on world diet, right? And I mean, you know, and it affects. There was a physician down in Australia, Gary Fettke, who was threatened with having his medical license taken away for, and I quote, inappropriately curing diabetes. And the people who were behind this was the Adventist Church in Australia.
How did he inappropriately cure diabetes?
Low carb diet. He's a orthopedic surgeon and he got sick of cutting people's limbs off when he had another way to cure their diabetes. So, yeah, they're most people aren't aware that this is going on and has been going on for 100+ years. I forget when Kellogg was, I think it was like the middle of the 1800s.
Hmm.
So yeah, unfortunately, diet is super susceptible to cults and cults are susceptible to diet. I mean, Judaism goes back 5,000 years and look at all the dietary rules that they have.
Yeah,
Right or wrong,
yeah.
not.
I mean, virtually every major religion has strong taboos and regulations that they place around eating. Whether it's when to
Yeah.
fast, when not to fast, what to eat, what to avoid completely. It's hard for me to think of a religion that doesn't have a lot to say about what to eat and why.
Right. Right. So yeah, it's just that's life.
So in some of the time we have left, seed oils, omega-6s, this area of the diet and metabolic health world, there's a lot we could talk about. Are there any areas that you want to get into, things that maybe you think are underappreciated about seed oils and how the dietary profile of what we eat actually affects health? Any, like, especially surprising things. Like, most people I don't think realize the potential connection there between linoleic acid and your liver and diabetes and things like that.
Well, given your background, let's talk about the endocannabinoid system.
Mm.
Um, so that study that I mentioned, where they lowered the linoleic acid level in this diet to 1% and replaced it with saturated fat, the mechanism they proposed for the anti-obesogenic effect of that change was that two of the endogenous cannabinoids, 2-AG and AHA, were reduced in the gut.
Hmm.
And that this reduced the hyperphagic signal that these animals were getting, and that's why they
Hmm.
lost this desire to overeat.
Yeah. And that makes
And
perfect sense to me because the omega-6s not only serve as precursors to some of the inflammatory things in the body that we got into earlier, they're also precursors to the endogenous cannabinoids. Endogenous cannabinoids are essentially like polyunsaturated fats.
right. And one of the two interventions, when I mentioned before about the body preferentially preferring omega-3 fats, they did two interventions, right? The first was to lower omega-6 to 1%. The second was to increase omega-3, right? Which also reduced the obesogenic effect. And they think that that happened because the omega-3 fats replaced the omega-6 arachidonic fats in the gut, therefore lowering the levels of hyperphagic precursors, right? And that gets us into this whole topic of these obesity drugs that are coming out,
Mm.
the incretins, right?
The GLP-1
From
drugs.
the GLP-1 drugs. You did an excellent podcast on this, that I listened to prior to coming on this. Incretins are downstream of the endocannabinoid system, is my small amount of reading I've done in this. And they seem to have benefits that go way behind obesity. And part of the benefit that they seem to have is because they're reducing the levels of these omega-6 oxidative products like HNE in the body, so that there's, a tie between, we're not looking at an independent mechanism when we're looking at these obesity reducing drugs potentially. And I was wondering if you've done any reading in that area. I mean, just, to give people a bit more of a background because we're definitely you
Yeah.
wanted something less more obscure.
Yeah, I
So
unfortunately I have not. What I can
okay,
tell you is, I can just sort of reiterate some of the things you have. The endogenous cannabinoids in our body, anandamide and 2-AG, 2-arachidonyl glycerol. They're essentially like little pieces of fat that get cleaved off of the cell membrane, and they serve as signaling
right,
molecules. And one of the things they do is basically promote hunger,
right.
promote feeding. This is essentially why THC through the CB1 receptor promotes feeding and drives the munchies when you consume marijuana, famously. Our
And
endogenous
why the
cannabinoids regulate appetite as well.
drug rimonabant, which is a CB1
Blocker.
antagonist, blocks that effect,
Yes, yes.
as well as making people want to commit suicide.
Yeah, because it turns out when you block the rewarding properties of food through CB1, you also block the rewarding properties of everything.
Life, yes.
Of life. Yeah. But I did not really realize there's this potential connection here between endocannabinoids and these GLP-1 drugs.
Yeah, they're downstream. I've looked at it a little bit enough to make me think there's a connection, but I haven't, it's a new field of research.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty much they're starting to notice that they have benefits that go beyond just weight loss. And it's tough to say why that's happening. And other interventions that also have an effect on the endocannabinoid system, like bariatric surgery, also have beneficial effects on things that you wouldn't think would be affected, like heart disease. There's a paper that I saw recently that said that people who have bariatric disease see a decline in their CAC score, right? The indicator of arterial calcification score that's a great
Mm.
predictor of heart disease risk. And when people go on these drugs and you talk, in your podcast, I was really interested to hear that people seem to have a similar change when they go on rimonabant, these GLP-1 agonists, or if they have bariatric surgery, where they spontaneously, if it's successful with bariatric surgery, switch to what we would call a healthy diet.
Hmm.
And the weight loss is partly following from that.
Hmm. I didn't realize that. Interesting. Um, so one thing I want to ask you actually, this maybe will be practical for people. So let's say someone tries to cut out the seed oils, they drastically lower their omega-6 intake if it's very high already, which it probably is for a lot of people. Um, it sounds like they would expect their total blood cholesterol levels to go up. Is that true? And what other changes would someone expect to see in their common blood biomarkers by cutting down on the omega-6 fatty acids?
Yeah, the even linoleic acid has varying effects on lipid levels. I would say it's consistently pro cholesterol lowering, but not always. And there are some papers you can find where cholesterol levels actually go up. After I switched to, I didn't really get any testing done on any of this stuff until after I'd switched, but I had my father around, and my father and my cholesterol levels were in a couple of points of each other. So it might go up, various different fatty acids. Saturated fats can have different effects on your cholesterol levels. Since I'm not of the opinion that cholesterol is what's driving cardiovascular disease, I don't really worry about it. But again, let me highlight, I'm not a doctor. I
Not
won't say
medical
I won't
advice.
give you medical advice because I will, but just remember I'm not a doctor. um, I mean, it's tough because if you take the average physician's advice for, say, diabetes treatment, you're gonna get worse.
Yeah.
Period. End of story. So I would be doing you a disservice if I told you to follow your doctor's advice if you're a diabetic.
Yeah. I have people in my family, type 2 diabetes, who've had it for over a decade. And in over 10 years, not a single of multiple physicians they saw even mentioned a continuous glucose monitor
Or a low carb diet,
or a low
probably.
carb diet, not once,
Right.
which
Whereas
is
when
totally insane.
I got involved in my father's healthcare at the end of his life, and he was at the point where he was looking at a diabetic foot ulcer and a possible amputation. And the doctor said to me, you know, well, we don't really have any way to treat him at this level of HbA1c, which was 6.4%. Technically, 6.5% is diabetic. He didn't even know he was diabetic, which he was. And I told the doctor, don't worry about the diabetes. That's easy. And 2 months later, he had a normal HbA1c level,
Mhm.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, so the whole I'm not a doctor thing, be a skeptic, especially be a skeptic of your physician and recognize that there are some things that they just, chronic diseases, they're horrible at. They're great at like setting bones. And if you're getting in a car accident, by all means, but they're
Yeah.
terrible at chronic disease.
Well, I mean, based on some of our earlier discussion too around liver stuff, fatty liver disease, it sounds like if you cut out soybean oil and other sources of omega sixes, that you could see improvements in your liver in terms of insulin sensitivity, in terms of fatty liver. Do you think that's likely, or that's been clearly demonstrated?
3 different human studies show that body weight, insulin resistance, and fatty liver. And I mean, fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, this is dumb, right? Because this wasn't even really a disease before 1980. It's new, right? And we know how to give it to people because we do it in hospitals every day with soybean oil.
Mm-hmm.
What's the most commonly consumed fat in the United States? Soybean oil. Why do we have 30% of people and 8% of non-obese children have fatty liver disease? Maybe it's the soybean oil. I don't know. Call me crazy. It's worth a shot.
Um, well, Tucker, this has been great. This is part of, I think, a new little mini podcast series I'm doing. I want to start talking to more people who aren't, necessarily
Outside the ivory tower.
Yeah, who are outside the ivory tower, because there is a lot to learn there, but you should, like you said, you should be skeptical of everyone inside and outside of the ivory tower.
Right.
Be skeptical of the people who are not doctors, and also be skeptical of the people that are doctors.
Well, it's the essence. Skepticism is the essence of science.
Yeah. Any final thoughts you want to leave people with? Anything you want to reiterate from our discussion today?
Um, I just, I'd like to make it was crazy how much better my health got. I mean, it was like visible, it was fast. Everybody in the office noticed and started asking me what I was doing differently. I mean, it was really shocking how fast I was able to change my health. And, we talked earlier about sunburn and a bunch of these other things. We have so many sunburn and seed oil anecdotes at this point. I was trying to keep track of them and gave up years ago. I mean, I think that's kind of the headliner. That's what really gets people's attention when you hear that claim. And a lot of people just dismiss it out of hand as being nuts, thinking it was nuts like I did when I first heard it. But having lived it for 15 years now and seen how many other people it's happened to, that's kind of the tip of the health iceberg here, right?
All right, Tucker Goodrich, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Nick. It's really an honor.